You were born to carry boxes, Cassian. Don't ruin the floor by bleeding on it. If you can save the minister's daughter and clear my name, I will leave the council and marry you.
In a world where power is measured by the height of your office and the purity of your bloodline, Cassian Graves is a man who doesn't exist. To the elite of the Global Security Council, he is merely the mover, a nameless face in a tan uniform who hauls their secrets in heavy crates. Among those who look through him is Serafina Vance, the council's icy prodigy, a woman who believes that intellect can solve what brute force cannot. But when a shadow operation turns into a national nightmare, Serafina's intellect fails her, and her allies turn into predators. Desperate and hunted, she is forced to descend into the cold vaults of the basement, seeking the only man whose past she couldn't erase, a man who once lived in the heart of the fire. Now she must wager her pride, her career, and her hand in marriage on the one man she spent years humiliating. The air in the federal evidence vault felt like frozen lead, thick with the scent of ozone and the weight of secrets that never saw the light of day. Cassian Graves adjusted his grip on a heavy titanium transport case, his muscles rippling beneath the faded tan canvas of his work shirt. He moved with a rhythmic, silent grace that belied his humble status as a logistics custodian. To the high-level officials who passed him in the corridors, he was a ghost in a tan uniform, as relevant as the dust on the shelves. He didn't mind the invisibility, because it was his armor against a world that had once burned him. His amber eyes remained fixed on the floor, avoiding the gaze of the elite guards flanking the entrance. The heavy pressurized doors hissed open, and the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees as Serafina Vance entered. She looked like a winter goddess in her midnight blue velvet blazer, her platinum bob-cut hair perfectly catching the sterile overhead lights. She was flanked by 3 senior analysts and a general who hung on her every word. Serafina stopped abruptly when she saw Cassian kneeling by a row of lockers, a wrench in his hand as he serviced a faulty magnetic lock. She didn't see a man who had survived 3 Black Ops tours in the Levant. She saw an obstacle in a dirty shirt. Serafina cleared her throat with a sound that was as sharp as a razor, her violet blue eyes narrowing behind a mask of cold boredom. Cassian did not look up immediately, carefully finishing the torque on a screw before setting the tool down with a muffled metallic clink. He stood slowly, towering over her but keeping his shoulders slightly hunched to minimize his imposing frame. He bowed his head just enough to acknowledge her presence, his 5 o'clock shadow catching the light. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone except him. "I thought I gave orders for the vault floor to be cleared of all maintenance staff during the high-security audit," Serafina said, her voice a low and dangerous purr. Cassian noted the slight tremor in her hands, a detail her peers missed, but he kept his face a mask of dull obedience. He spoke in his characteristic low rumble, explaining that the lock was failing and would have trapped her inside within 20 minutes. His tone was neutral, devoid of the flattery she usually received from her subordinates. Serafina let out a cold, mocking laugh that echoed off the reinforced concrete walls, drawing amused smirks from the analysts behind her. "You truly believe you understand the mechanics of this facility better than the automated sensors, don't you, Cassian?" she asked, stepping closer until he could smell the faint scent of expensive jasmine and cold metal. She reached out and flicked a speck of grease from his collar with a look of profound disgust. "It is adorable that a crate carrier thinks he possesses a functional intellect. But please, stay in your lane." One of the younger analysts, eager to impress the chief strategist, stepped forward and kicked Cassian's toolbox, spilling heavy wrenches across the floor. "Watch your mouth when the director is speaking to you, grease monkey," the analyst sneered, looking for a reaction that never came. Cassian simply looked at the tools on the floor, and then back at the analyst with a gaze so steady and devoid of fear that the younger man instinctively stepped back. Cassian didn't say a word, his silence acting as a mirror that reflected the analyst's cowardice. Serafina watched the interaction, her violet eyes flickering with a moment of confusion at Cassian's lack of anger. Most men would have flared with pride or cowered in shame, but this man stood like a stone wall in a storm. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to break that composure, to see what lay beneath the calm surface. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "You were born to carry boxes, Cassian. Don't ruin the floor by bleeding on it when the real professionals arrive." Cassian finally met her gaze, his amber eyes locking onto hers with a depth that made her breath hitch for a fraction of a second. "The lock is still compromised, ma'am," he said quietly, ignoring the insult entirely. "If the foreign minister arrives for the briefing, the secondary failsafe will trigger." He was giving her a lifeline, a warning born of years of tactical experience, but her pride was a wall he couldn't climb. She turned her back on him with a flourish of her velvet blazer, signaling that the conversation was over. The security detail moved in, physically pushing Cassian toward the service exit, as if he were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. He allowed himself to be moved, his body yielding with a practiced ease that made the guards feel stronger than they actually were. As he passed the threshold, he looked back one last time at the heavy vault door. He saw the red light of the secondary sensor flicker, a tiny heartbeat of impending disaster that Serafina was too arrogant to notice. Upstairs, the world was preparing for a historic diplomatic breakthrough, but down here, the foundation was cracking. Serafina's laughter drifted through the posing doors, a bright and brittle sound that masked the growing rot in her operation. She was the architect of a new world order, and she had just insulted the only man capable of holding up the ceiling. Cassian walked down the dark service tunnel, his boots echoing with a steady military precision that no one was listening to. He reached his small, cramped locker room and sat on a wooden bench, the dim yellow light casting long shadows across his scarred knuckles. He didn't feel the sting of her words. He felt the familiar, cold hum of a mission about to go sideways. He knew the extraction plan she had authored for the double agent was flawed because it relied on theory rather than the bloody reality of the streets. He pulled a small, encrypted radio from a hidden compartment in his locker, his fingers moving with a speed that would have shocked the analysts above. Suddenly, the floor shook with the muffled thud of a distant explosion, followed by the high-pitched wail of the facility's emergency sirens. The lights flickered and died, plunged into the crimson glow of the backup generators. Cassian stood up, his posture shifting instantly from a slouching custodian to a predator in his natural habitat. He didn't rush toward the exit. He reached for his tactical gear. Above him, he could hear the screams of the elite, and through the vents, the first scent of gunpowder began to drift. The sirens screamed like wounded animals through the ventilation shafts of the federal evidence vault, casting the sterile corridors in a rhythmic, terrifying The sirens screamed like wounded animals through the ventilation shafts of the federal evidence vault, casting the sterile corridors in a rhythmic, terrifying, blood-red pulse. Serafina Vance clung to the edge of a shattered mahogany desk, her platinum hair now matted with dust and a thin trickle of blood from a graze on her temple. The extraction had been a massacre. The elite guards she had trusted were either dead or had fled into the shadows of the malfunctioning facility. Outside the heavy reinforced doors, the muffled sound of rhythmic hammer drills echoed, signaling that the kidnappers were breaching the final barrier to the foreign minister's daughter. Serafina's world, built on the foundations of logic and high-status connections, had collapsed into a chaotic nightmare of smoke and screams. She reached for her silver communicator, but her fingers shook so violently that the device clattered to the floor, sliding into the darkness. Every one of her political allies had gone silent, their encrypted lines disconnected the moment the first explosion rocked the building. She was the architect of this failure, the woman whose arrogance had led a child into a trap, and her own career into a grave. The weight of her looming disgrace felt heavier than the concrete ceiling groaning above her. In the flickering crimson light, she saw the silhouette of a man standing at the end of the corridor, his frame broad and unmoving, amidst the swirling haze of debris. It was Cassian Graves, but the stooped, submissive custodian she had mocked hours ago was gone. He stood with a predatory stillness, his tan work shirt discarded to reveal a charcoal tactical vest laden with specialized equipment. He was checking the slide of a suppressed sidearm with a mechanical efficiency that made the air feel colder. Serafina watched him, her breath hitching in her throat as she realized that the grease monkey was the only living thing moving toward the danger rather than away from it. She tried to call out his name, but her voice was a hoarse, pathetic rasp that was swallowed by the roar of a nearby secondary blast. Cassian turned his head slightly, his amber eyes locking onto hers with a clarity that was almost terrifying. He didn't offer a comforting word or a hand to help her up. He simply adjusted a comms link in his ear and began moving toward the breach. The realization hit Serafina with the force of a physical blow. She had spent years ensuring this man remained invisible, and now he was the only person on Earth who could save her. She scrambled to her feet, her expensive velvet blazer torn and stained with soot, and chased after him through the smog. She tripped over a fallen support beam, falling to her knees just a few feet behind his steady, rhythmic pace. "Cassian, please," she sobbed, the elitist mask finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. He stopped, but did not turn around, his gaze fixed on the thermal signature appearing on his wrist-mounted display. The kidnapping team had the girl, and they were moving toward the subterranean extraction point she had designed herself. Serafina realized that her arrest warrant for criminal negligence was already being drafted in the offices above. If the minister's daughter died, Serafina wouldn't just lose her job. She would be hunted by every intelligence agency on the planet for her failure. She crawled toward him, her hands scraping against the rough concrete floor, until she could reach the hem of his tactical trousers. "I have nothing left," she whispered, her voice trembling with a raw, visceral despair that she had never allowed herself to feel before. "My allies have abandoned me, and the council is preparing to sacrifice me to save themselves." She looked up at him, her violet blue eyes streaming with tears that carved tracks through the dust on her porcelain skin. She saw the scars on his arms, the marks of a warrior she had treated like a servant, and a wave of crushing shame washed over her. In a moment of reckless, emotional clarity, Serafina gripped his hand, her fingers trembling against his grease-stained skin. "If you can save her, if you can bring that girl back and clear my name from this bloodbath, I will give you everything," she gasped. Cassian finally looked down at her, his expression unreadable, a stone monolith in a sea of fire. "I will leave the council. I will leave my world, my status, and my name behind," she continued, her voice gaining a frantic, desperate edge. "I will be your wife. I will stand by you in the shadows. I will marry you. Just don't let this be my end." The silence that followed was more intense than the explosions echoing in the distance. Cassian didn't smile, and he didn't mock her for the absurdity of a high-ranking official proposing to a disgraced custodian in a burning basement. He simply reached down and closed his large, calloused hand over hers, a silent pact sealed in the ruins of her pride. The warmth of his grip was the first thing that had felt real to her in years. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and for the first time she saw the fire of the operative he used to be. "Stay in this alcove and do not move until I return for you," Cassian commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that commanded total obedience. He didn't ask for a map or instructions. He knew the layout of the facility better than she did because he had been the one repairing its hidden flaws, the echoes of his boots the only heartbeat in the dying building. She curled into a ball, clutching her knees, finally understanding the true cost of the arrogance she had worn like armor. Minutes felt like hours as the sounds of suppressed gunfire and muffled shouts drifted through the vents. Serafina listened to the symphony of Cassian's work, the sharp, rhythmic pops of a professional dismantling a superior force. She realized then that she had never actually known power. She had only known the bureaucracy of it. Real power was currently moving through the dark, silent and lethal, fighting for a woman who had treated him with nothing but contempt. She prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to in years, promising that if they survived, she would keep every word of her reckless vow. Suddenly, the heavy security door at the end of the hall groaned and was kicked off its hinges with a violent metallic crash. Serafina flinched, shielding her eyes, expecting the kidnappers to come for her last. Instead, a small, trembling figure emerged from the smoke, the minister's daughter, clutching a tattered teddy bear, but otherwise unharmed. Behind her, walking with the calm stride of a man returning from a simple errand, was Cassian. He was reloading his weapon, his face splattered with a few drops of blood that weren't his, looking as stoic as the day he first arrived at the vault. He walked toward Serafina, the girl safely tucked under one arm, and stopped in front of her. "The mission is complete, and the evidence of the council's betrayal is on this drive," he said, holding out a small silver device. Serafina looked at the drive, then at the girl, and finally at the man who had just saved her soul. She didn't see a logistics worker. She saw the man she was now bound to by a promise she intended to keep. She reached out to touch his arm, her fingers trailing over the logistics patch he still wore, and for the first time, the icy chief strategist felt the heat of true, terrifying love. The dawn light filtered through the reinforced glass of the Global Security Council headquarters, casting long, sharp shadows over the marble floors. Serafina Vance sat in the center of the grand briefing room, her posture stiff, her face a mask of weary resolve, despite the charcoal smudges still visible on her neck. Surrounding her were the titans of the intelligence world, men in bespoke suits who had spent the last 6 hours preparing her professional execution. They spoke in hushed, predatory tones, leafing through the preliminary reports of the disaster at the vault. They were ready to strip her of her rank, her title, and her freedom, viewing her as a fallen queen whose time had finally run out.
"Where is the girl, Serafina?" the senior chairman demanded, his voice echoing with a cold, hollow authority. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a man about to eliminate a rival. "We have reports of a total security collapse, and yet you sit here in silence while the minister demands an explanation. You authorized a failed operation, and the blood of those assets is on your hands." Serafina did not flinch, her gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. She knew that the world thought she was finished, but she also knew that the man she had once called irrelevant was currently moving through the building like a silent storm.
The doors swung open with a heavy, deliberate thud that silenced the room instantly. Cassian Graves walked in, no longer the stooping custodian, but a man who radiated a quiet, terrifying power. He was wearing a clean black tactical uniform, the logistics patch replaced by a silver insignia that made the chairman's face turn a ghostly shade of white. In his right hand, he led the minister's daughter, who looked up at him with a sense of safety that no amount of council security had ever provided. In his left hand, he carried a ruggedized tablet, the screen glowing with the data that would either save or destroy everyone in the room.
Cassian walked to the center of the hall, ignoring the gasps of the analysts who recognized him as the man they had mocked for carrying their crates. He didn't offer a salute or a bow. He stood with the poise of a judge delivering a final verdict. He placed the tablet on the central console, and a holographic display bloomed in the air, showing the encrypted communications of the chairman himself. The data revealed the true architects of the ambush, the very men sitting in judgment of Serafina. The room fell into a suffocating silence as the evidence of their treason played out in high-definition clarity.
Serafina stood up, her violet blue eyes burning with a mixture of pride and a deep, aching regret. She looked at the men who had planned her downfall, and then at the man who had prevented it. "You called him a grease monkey," she said,
her voice steady and echoing with a new kind of authority. "You told me he was a broken tool, a peasant with no place in our world." She walked toward Cassian, stopping only when she was inches from him, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the silver insignia on his chest. It turns out, he was the only one in this building who knew what honor actually looked like. The chairman tried to speak, to offer a defense or a lie, but Cassian's amber eyes locked onto him with a weight that seemed to physically pin the man to his chair. "I am not here for your politics," Cassian said, his low rumble vibrating through the floorboards. "I am here because a promise was made in the dark, and I have come to collect." The security detail, recognizing the legendary operator they had thought was long dead, instinctively stood at attention. The men who had insulted Cassian hours ago now looked at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the man they had treated as trash. As federal agents entered to take the chairman into custody, the chaos of the room faded into the background for Serafina. She looked at Cassian, waiting for the moment he would walk away, back into the shadows where he felt most at home. Instead, he remained standing by her side, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling storm of the council's collapse. She realized that the logistics worker she had humiliated had not just saved her career, he had saved the very core of her humanity. The shame she felt for her past actions was a cold weight, but the warmth of his hand on her shoulder was a promise of redemption. "I meant what I said, Cassian," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible over the shouting of the arrests. "I will leave all of this behind. The titles, the velvet, the power, none of it matters if I'm standing in a room full of ghosts." She looked around at the cold marble walls of the institution she had worshipped, realizing how empty it truly was. She saw the way the other officials looked at Cassian with fear and awe, and she knew she would rather be the wife of a ghost than the queen of a graveyard. Cassian looked at her, his rugged features softening for the first time since the explosion. He saw the sincerity in her violet blue eyes, the way she didn't care that the elite were watching them. He reached out and gently removed her designer spectacles, looking at the woman beneath the mask of the chief strategist. "You don't have to leave everything," he said, his voice dropping to an unexpected tenderness. "But you will have to learn to walk in the shadows with me. It's a long way down from the ivory tower, Serafina."
"I'm already down," she replied, a small, genuine smile breaking through her exhaustion. "And I find the air much cleaner here." She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his scarred knuckles, and led him toward the exit. The analysts and guards parted like the Red Sea, watching in stunned silence as the most powerful woman in the agency walked away from her throne, hand in hand with the man they had spent years looking through. It was a scandal that would be whispered about for decades, but Serafina didn't hear the whispers. She only heard the steady beat of Cassian's heart. Outside, the morning sun was finally beginning to warm the cold concrete of the city. They stood on the steps of the headquarters, the minister's daughter safely in the hands of her grateful father. The world was resetting itself, the traitors were in chains, and the logistics worker was the hero of a story no one would ever be allowed to print. Cassian looked out at the horizon, his mission finally over, his debt to the past paid in full. He felt a light pressure on his arm and turned to find Serafina looking at him with a devotion that transcended rank and status. They walked down the steps, leaving the world of elite intelligence behind, heading toward a future that had no titles and no crates to carry. In the quiet of the morning, the soap opera of their lives reached its final, silent crescendo. A woman who had everything found out she had nothing, and a man who had nothing proved he was worth everything. As they disappeared into the crowd, the only thing that remained was the memory of a reckless promise and the honor of a man who refused to be broken. The invisible hero had finally found a home, and the fallen queen had finally found her king.